Hi, I'm Shelley with Shelley Parker Art, and I'm so glad that you are here to learn this fun snowman round piece. I'm going to teach you step by step how to paint this fun round. Let me go ahead and add it to the stage so you can see what we're talking about, what we're going to be making. I did add a little bit of the blue interference, which I'm going to talk about in a little while, but under the camera, it looks a little bit more bright than it does in person. The interference is kind of an interesting paint. You can see it a little bit here. I used it on the letters too, but it's a kind of a color shifting paint. This is on a 12 by 12 round. I am going to be adding glass and resin to mine. You certainly don't have to. If you want to use this as a door hanger, it would probably be better not to add glass and resin because resin does yellow when it's exposed to sunlight. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. But I think it would be beautiful just displayed on a tabletop easel. You can see the large piece behind me, that's the original piece. That class is available on the Patreon channel. You can see his little lantern is lit up. In that class, I teach exactly how to make that lantern and get it to light up. I do quite a few lit pieces. I think that they're really fun to decorate with. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what you get with this free class. With all of the classes, I offer a tracer. So if you don't want to use the wood cutouts, you certainly don't have to. So I have printed out, just so I can show you. This is the tracer workbook that you get. So you get the full size image, which you would be able, if you're good at that kind of thing, you can resize it to any size you want. Say you wanted to do an 18-inch round instead of a 12-inch round. You could use this full tracer to resize it. But the 12 by 12 tracers are printed out, are made for you to print out so that you just cut them apart, tape them together, and then you would be able to trace your design onto whatever substrate you wanted to work with. You can see this bottom left doesn't really have a lot, but it's perfectly sized that once you cut it apart and tape it together, you have the tracer for this. The wood cutouts are available on shelleyparkerart.com. So when you order the wood cutout, you can choose to get it with the lettering or without. And then we have two different phrases that you can choose from. You can choose the "Let It Snow" phrase or the "Hello Winter" phrase. So if you do order any wood cutouts from me, they always come with what we call a backer, and then the letters or shapes are inside of the backer. And then they're taped with painter's tape to keep them a little bit safer during shipping. So when you remove the painter's tape, you just want to be a little bit gentle. Some of the cutouts are a little bit more fragile than others. So let me go ahead and pull in the first video here, and then you'll be able to see the wood cutouts. So with this piece, the 12-inch round backer is not included in the wood cutouts that I offer, mostly because they're relatively inexpensive to get. You can get I don't remember, I think they come in packs of 3, but you can order them on Amazon. This is a real thin one. It's probably an 1/8 inch thick birch round. And then over at the bottom right side, you can see my palette. This is just my general palette. In all of my videos that I use for my classes, I use a very limited palette. And in the description of this video, I have linked the video that I did that shows all of these colors. When I set up my palette, I like to put out all of these colors. Because of the way that I set up my palette, I'm able to use my palette for many, many weeks, even months. So I like to just put out my standard colors. I like to have them living in the same place on my palette. It becomes sort of muscle memory to reach into the different colors, but also by having them live in a normal place, I don't get confused between where the phthalo blue is and where the ultramarine blue is. So here I'm just using the white gesso. I like using the white gesso for the background. It's just a little bit thinner than the heavy body acrylics that I like to use. So for covering a background like this, it's nice to get that coverage in. But before we do anything with the gesso, what I like to do is use GAC 100 to do a little sealer coat on all of the wood pieces. This just gives a little bit of a barrier coat between the wood and the gesso layer, or whatever background color that you use. It just ensures that nothing, no oils or anything from the woods are going to seep into our paint colors later. So I cover everything with the GAC 100. With the wood cutouts that are cut on the laser, I like to clean all of the edges of those with alcohol. So just with a paper towel and the 90% alcohol, I just clean all of the edges just to make sure that there's no residue from the laser cuts that are going to get into my piece. So as I do this background, I'm using one of my favorite really cheap brushes. I think this is a Royal & Langnickel set. I really like them. They're really inexpensive, but I'm just doing a really light background. I've got a little bit of the blue. I made the sky blue with phthalo blue, a little bit of burnt sienna, and for the sky, a little bit of that gesso. And I'm just doing kind of sweeping, crisscrossing strokes across that that background. It's a little bit difficult. It's light, so it's a little bit difficult for the camera to pick up some of that the nuances. But I wanted to keep it somewhat light at this first stage. If you feel like your paint is sticking a little bit too much, and you can see it as I'm working with it here, sometimes when I pull the brush across, it almost pulls the round that I'm working on. So on my palette to the right there, you can see that I have two little condiment cups. One of those condiment cups has the airbrush medium, and the other condiment cup has an extender, something that keeps my paint wet longer. And I like to use these for me and the paints that I use. I find that the airbrush medium and the extender work better for me than actually thinning it with water. If water works for you, then water is perfectly fine too. And I want to just talk for a moment about the paints that I use. My favorite paints are the golden heavy body acrylic paints. That's mostly what you see on my palette. I have a few Utrecht heavy body paints that I'm still using up a little bit. I've found over the years that they just don't keep as well. They seem to kind of gel and get a really weird consistency. So I really do like the golden heavy body acrylics. If you don't have professional grade paints yet, please just use what you have. Mixing any of the blues, just lightly, just to make kind of a lighter blue color. But I like the variations that you get with the brush strokes. So I'm not doing just a flat coverage of that light blue color. I'm letting some of the areas be a little bit darker, letting some of the areas be a little bit lighter. So with all of these colors, please don't feel like you need to rush out and spend a lot of money on the heavy body paints. However, if you are wanting to get serious about your art, the investment into professional paints is worth it. You'll get so much of a better result from using the professional paints. You won't fight with it as much. So they're worth an investment. And that's why I really like the limited palette that I show at Shelley Parker Art, because you can get just a few colors and not have to go invest in every color that there is. So I'm going to take that video down and add in the next video. Here I've added my snowman onto the top just to kind of get a feel for how he looks on there. And I just held up my brushes that I'm going to be using. I love this set of Filbert brushes. I got it on Amazon. It's a very, very, very cheap set of brushes. I like using cheap brushes. I think that I want to be kind of rough with my brushes. I want to be able to just scrub the paint in and not worry about having to be very careful with super expensive brushes. Just going to check my audio real quick just to make sure that it's actually working. That's always a bummer when things don't work the way you think. I was going to mention also, and I wonder where I put it. All of the links for the tracer workbook that I talked about a moment ago, and I'll be adding also this picture of my paint mixes that I used. That's another thing that we often have with our classes, so that you can see the actual mixes that I'm doing. So for the snowman, I did a similar mix to what we did with the sky. So again, it's phthalo blue, a little bit of burnt sienna, and some titanium white to make a light bluish gray. And that's going to be the shadows for our snowman. So you can see me there opening up those two mediums that I mentioned before that I like to use. That whiter one is the airbrush medium, and then the clear one is just a liquid extender. Winsor & Newton has a great one. I've had students ask me, how do you know if you should be using the airbrush medium or if you should be using the liquid extender? The way that I know has to do with if I'm wanting my paints to dry quickly. So when I'm wanting to do more of a soft technique that blends sort of the colors, if I want those paints to stay wet, then I thin down my paint with the extender liquid. If I'm wanting my paint to dry quicker, then I'll dip into the airbrush medium to thin my paint out. So on my palette, I'm just mixing some different values of that bluish gray that I talked about a moment ago. And then as soon as I mix, the first time that I bring my brush onto my piece, I'm assessing if that's the right color. And if you feel like it's not the right color, then go back to your palette and just mix it again. What we're looking for here is a gray that's a little bit more on the blue side. So for my snowman, I'm treating it as if the light source is coming from the right. So I want the right side, as he's facing me, to be lighter. But I need some of these dark shadow colors to help some of that lighter color show through later. And because I'm using the wood cutouts, I don't have to be very careful about the brim line because the other wood piece is going to be setting on top. But in this particular cutout, the scarf is not another piece, so I'll be a little bit more careful as I paint in that area. In the big one, he does have his scarf is a separate wood cutout that sets on top, and that dimension really adds. It's stunning in person. When you walk up to it, you just are drawn to it because of all of the layers and all of the dimension that the wood cutouts add. One of the other big advantages to painting on the wood cutouts is you don't have to spend all of the time tracing the image because it's already there for you. And you can see on the wood cutout for the snowman that there's also engraved marks that help you see some of the shapes. As I paint here over his face, I can still see the mouth shape and the eyes shape underneath. So I don't have to worry about losing any of those lines like you do sometimes when you're not using the wood cutouts. So for selling artists, it can really be a big time saver. I was trying to adjust the lights so that some of the variation that I'm getting here with the shadows on his face would show up a little bit better. So I'm coming in and just darkening that left side again. These are very light paint strokes, just adding in some of that shadowy color. And then under his brim a little bit. Again, the nice thing about the wood cutouts is that the shape, the hat shape that will go on top, the dimension of it kind of casts its own shadow. So it does some of the work for you. So I think that a lot of times people struggle with not allowing their paints to dry in between layers. So if you're painting and you're beginning to see that your brush is leaving more marks, or it feels like the brush is pulling up some of the layers that you've already put down, just step away from it for a little while, take a little break, give it a little bit of time to dry. I do like using the extender mediums that keep my paints wet a little bit longer. So sometimes I have a little bit more time in between. I do use a hair dryer sometimes to try to help dry things a little bit and speed things up. But if you're fighting with it, then it's probably a sign that you need to take just a little break and let that layer dry, and then come back and do the additional details on top that you want to do. So I'm just remixing. Sometimes, as you're painting, you end up bringing in a little bit too much of the white and kind of losing that darker color. So I like to brush mix, and um, I don't really mix a big pile of any particular color. I know what the colors are, and because of the limited palette, that really helps me to know what the colors are. So I like to keep brush mixing, and the nice thing about not mixing a great big pile of a certain color is that you continue to get those variations in the color that really add interest to your final piece. So I never worry about having to go back to my palette and remix more paint. So I'm coming in, these are the body shapes. I'm giving a little bit of a shadow underneath of the scarf. And then you can just barely see on this particular piece, just a tiny bit of that, his bottom body part. So I'm just trying to add in a little bit more shadow there to show some of the shape. At the end of this video, I will be loading it to our Patreon channel. So you'll be able to go to the Patreon channel. The link is in this video, and you'll be able to download my color mix sheet, and you'll be able to download the tracer workbook. So you'll be able to save that and have that for yourself. So you saw that I just put in that shadow by the arm, and then I'm coming back in with the titanium white lighter mixture. Even though this looks very light, it's not pure white. It does still have some of this blue gray in it. And through all of this, I haven't washed my brush. So the paint that's already in my brush also helps me to blend these areas together. I still have some of the light in my brush or some of the darker gray in my brush at any given time. There's that bottom section that I talked about before. I think another frustration that a lot of beginning artists especially have is that they get upset that they have to go back in and restate shadows. They feel like it can feel like when you watch a tutorial, it seems like it goes together really quickly, and they don't really get the full impact for the number of layers. I talk a lot in my classes about embracing those layers, because all of the work that you did on the layer before, even though you feel like I just wasted my time, I covered it all up, all paints have a certain amount of transparency, more so if we add a lot of water or mediums to thin them down. So all of that work that you did underneath does affect the paint color, and it really does add a lot to the piece. So I never worry about needing to go back in. At this point, when I'm adding in these highlights, I'm not worried about whether or not I need to come back in, as I'm doing here, and add more shadow. If you do feel like the brush strokes that you're making are changing the piece too much, you don't feel like you're getting as smooth of a blend as you would like, then one of the things may be that your paintbrush has too much paint in it. So before you try to come back in and sort of, I don't like to think of it as blending, because I think when you think about blend, you expect that it's going to be super smooth. What I'm trying to do is just pull the two colors together a little bit so that the transition is easy. I like the brush strokes. I don't want to super blend it. I just want to pull them together a little bit. But if there's too much paint in your brush, you're going to end up pulling that paint more into the sections that you're trying to blend. So it's as much of an art to manage your paintbrush as it is to actually, get the shapes and the art on the actual piece. The other thing that is important to remember is if I'm trying to bring more of the shadow into the light, then I want to start my brush on the shadow and pull in to the light. If I'm trying to take more of the light into the shadow, then I start my brush on the lighter area and pull that into the dark area or into the shadow area. I showed there that I'm picking up a bigger brush. I noticed on this section that the paint strokes that I was making were becoming very streaky. And so I'm watching for that all of the time as I'm painting. And you always be thinking about, am I using the right brush? Because if you're trying to use a brush that's too small, you're really going to struggle with it. It's going to begin to feel more tight. We always want to use the biggest brush that we can use for the size. And it's easy to be like, I don't want to have to wash another brush, or I don't want to go through the steps of getting another brush out. But don't let yourself fall in that trap. Just grab a bigger brush. You'll be much happier with the results. If you do get to a point where you feel like you're struggling, I talked a little bit earlier about it may be that you just need to take a break and let the layer that you have on your piece dry more. The other things that are important to think about are managing your brush. So again, what I was speaking about before, making sure that you don't have your brush too loaded with paint. The other thing that I'm always looking at if I'm struggling a little bit is the consistency of my paint. So for these first layers, the base layers, I want a thinner paint. If your brush, as you make a stroke, if it isn't making the mark that you're expecting, try thinning out your paint a little bit. Like I said, when I thin out my paint, I like to use either the liquid extender or the airbrush medium. For me, those work better. I don't know if you can see my awful, dirty little cloth to the side. I have two big dogs, Um, and Higgins likes to steal my paper towels and try to eat them. So in my studio, I like to try to use the cloth rags for my paintbrushes rather than the paper towels. So I've mixed a red here to start. I'm going to be using the same red on the scarf and his hat band and the cardinal. So I've mixed, this is Naphthol Red Light and a little bit of quinacridone magenta. And then I added in a little bit of phthalo blue for the darker areas. I think that red, maybe red and yellow, those two colors are um, probably look the worst on the first pass that you make, the very first layer that you put down. So be ready for that. I always, yeah, anytime I get red out, I always just brace myself for the first coats of this are gonna not look as good. So again, I'm going to build the shape. I'm going to let it be darker underneath of that fold of the scarf on his, what is his right side or our left. And I'm going to let it become much brighter as it gets to our right side, the side that is our light source. So you can see me on that filbert really pushing down on the belly of the brush and allowing the edge of the bristles to draw that line across. And I think you can probably pick out the little darker area that's across the center of the scarf there. Like I mentioned before, I really like to, even on this first sort of block in, the first look, I still like to have some of the variations in the color. I really don't like to make my first coat, my first block in, just one solid color. So I just keep going back to my palette and mixing colors that are a little bit different. I needed a dark color, so I've added a little bit more of the phthalo blue. Um, at one point through the shadows here, I added a little bit of burnt umber. Burnt umber is a great color to have. It's not a color that I included in the limited palette that I listed. You can easily make a burnt umber or what's close to a burnt umber by mixing up an orange. So you can use a quinacridone magenta and any of the yellows, mix up an orange, and then add a little bit of black to that orange, and you'll have a color that's very close to burnt umber. It's a great convenience color to have. So it is something that I recommend to the students who take my classes, that it's a nice color to get eventually. But if you're just starting out, it's easy to mix something that's close. But the burnt umber in there just, again, helps me to build up the shadows. Coming in with just a little bit of a brighter red right on the front. And with all of these colors, with all of these sections, it'll take a couple of layers to really to really build up that brightness. So even with the white on his face and the highlights on his belly and hand, um, it takes a couple of different passes at it to get it to the point that it really makes the impact that you want. So while I have that color on my brush, I'm going to go ahead and do the hat band. Same process here. I'm trying to build in a little bit of the shape by um, adding the shadow first. So the shadow on this left side. As I was painting here, you'll see me a couple of times dip into the airbrush medium. If your paint isn't spreading the way that you want it to, just thin it a little bit with the airbrush medium. Sometimes I will just dip my brush into the airbrush medium and paint that on the surface of my piece just to help me spread out the paint that's on the surface. And like I mentioned before, you can certainly use water if that works well for you. I find with my style of painting, maybe, or the way that my paints are, the water seems to just kind of eat into my paints more. The airbrush medium seems to just do a gentler job of thinning out my paints. So adding in a few of the shadows here, but you can see that um, my brush is beginning to leave some marks here. That's a good indication that I just need to let that dry. So um, my main goal here before I let it dry is just to try to make sure that I don't have any stark lines. I just want to try to smooth it out a little bit, let that dry, and then come back in. So here's our little cardinal piece that ends up setting up on our snowman's hand. And the wood cutout, you're going to see how quickly this comes together. The wood cutout for this is just, and you can just paint it so much more quickly than if you were trying to paint the cardinal that you just used a tracer for. So he's pretty small. I don't have to do a whole lot with him. Um, I, I enjoy the painting process so much, so I love to get into the details. But with very little time, you can have this cardinal painted and looking amazing. So this is just the same mixture that I was talking about before: naphthol red light, some quinacridone magenta, a little bit of phthalo blue for the shadow areas. And then all I really want to do with the shadow areas is try to make sure that that the viewer can easily see the difference between where his wing is and where his tail is. So I'm going to let the wing be a little bit brighter, do some shadowing at the base of the tail and underneath of that wing. Just mixing up a little bit more, just a little bit darker. Want to bump up the shadow a little bit. And then this color for his legs are a little bit, it's, have you looked up a cardinal's legs? They kind of have it's kind of a pinky gray color that their legs are. So I mixed a little bit of a purple with the gray, and then I come back in with more gray color just for some variation, just to break up and not let it look too purple. So a little bit of quinacridone magenta and a little bit of phthalo blue to mix up a purple-ish color. And then I happened on my palette to have a little bit of gray that I'd used on a previous piece. You could mix, of course, black and a little bit of titanium white for that gray, or you could use the same blue gray that we've mixed before. And it's a really good idea as you're doing your piece to reuse some of those colors that you've used before. I realized at this point that I didn't have Mars Black out on my palette. And for those that have watched my classes before, you know that I've been fighting with the black that I had from the Utrecht line. So it was a joy to get out the golden better paint and use it on this piece. So I'm just using a really tiny little filbert here to come in and paint the black part of his mask. And then I had a little bit of orange on my palette, again, from a previous painting that I've done. But again, really easy to mix up an orange from either the quinacridone magenta and the cad yellow, or of course, you could use the naphthol red. You could, of course, use both of those, the quinacridone magenta and the red with some yellow. You can add in a little bit of burnt umber to darken it for just a little hint of a shadow. Another way to darken it would be to add in a little bit of phthalo blue. Of course, the blue is a complement to orange, so it's a good choice for darkening that orange too, but it's tiny, and we don't need a lot of detail in his beak. So now I'm going to come in and tap in the eye shape. I'm starting with a little bit of thinned titanium white, and I'm just going to tap that in the eye area. What I'm trying to get is a little bit of the lighter eye ring that birds have. It can really add a lot of character. So I just started with the white and then go in and set in the dark center of the eye. I love painting eyes, so I think that I went back and forth with this eye a number of times. Again, it's tiny, and it really is probably a waste of time to get too particular about this little tiny eye. But the eye, of course, is where a lot of the personality of any of our paintings comes from. So I don't know, it's fun to do. But I like to do a little bit of blue often in the eyes that I paint. So I'm adding just a touch of blue. I think that that's a good reflection of the sky. Again, adds some life to him. And I never worry when especially on something that is as small as this, I never worry about getting that first mark a little bit too big. I can set it back into place by going back to the black and just dotting the black back in, and it pushes that shape back. So if you're painting this and you feel like, oh my gosh, I just made a great big mistake. I've got this big blob of either the blue or the white highlight that you're trying to put on his eye. Don't worry. Just touch back into it with the black again and push it back in shape. And then here I'm going back in with a little bit of that red and redefining the outer shape of the eye. Same thing that I was just talking about. I'm just pushing it back into place a little bit more. So I'm coming in with some little tiny strokes of a lighter red, just adding a little bit of detail. Again, it's tiny, it doesn't need a lot, but you can go back and forth a little bit between putting some little darker marks in the little feathers along his crest. Red can really be one of those colors that is hard to get a highlight on because if we mix titanium white with the red, of course, we're going to get a pink color, and that's really not what we're looking for on our cardinal here. So here's that lighter gray that I was talking about. I came back in and just did some little marks on his feet. And then I'll oftentimes, instead of washing my brush, I'll dip it in my airbrush medium and then wipe my brush out so that I have just a damp brush. And I'll go back in and tap that gray just to settle it in a little bit, help pull it into the other color. So I'll paint his carrot nose really quick, that same orange that we used before. I kind of struggled with holding this carrot down. I'll show you in just a moment on the video. If you're working with the wood cutouts, it really is handy for some of these smaller pieces to use a piece of painter's tape, and I just fold back the edges and put it down on my work surface, and then in that way the sticky side is up on the painter's tape, and then I can set all the little pieces down on it. It just keeps them from bouncing around. Putting in a few detail marks on this shape. Again, quinacridone magenta and a little bit of burnt umber. And I purposely make these marks a little bit too big here. The shadow is a little bit too much because I like to come back in with the orange over the top of it and push them back a little bit. Going back and forth like that between adding shadows and adding highlights really will build so much interest. I think a lot of times when we're starting out in painting, we expect that the first look at it should be perfect. When you get to the point where you can loosen up a little bit and let it purposefully be more shadow than you know that you need, push it back into place with the orange again, going back and forth like that it's those little things that really begin to make your pieces come to life and have so much interest. People walking up to it and being amazed at the brushstrokes that you've made and the piece that you've created. So it's a little bit lighter here along the top. I just dotting in a little bit of a highlight. You see me wiping off my brush, controlling how much paint is in my brush. So here's the tape that I was talking about before. Just pull out a long strip of it, fold under the edge so that the sticky side is on the top, but that folded under edge helps to tape it down to your piece. And now I'm just going to lay out the letters that will go on the piece. The bad thing about the painter's tape that I struggled with a little bit when I was painting this piece is that it's such a bright blue that it really makes it difficult to judge the color of blue that you're putting on the letters. So color is very affected by what it's around. So that's a little bit of a struggle, but as long as we're using the same colors that we've used in the blues for the background and in the blue grays for the snowman, it will all go together. So I'm just adding a little bit more of the phthalo blue to the gray that I had before. Remember the gray, and one of my favorite grays is the burnt sienna with the phthalo blue. It just makes it just a really interesting gray, so much more interesting than just mixing black and white. So I'm just adding just a little bit more of the blue to that original gray that I used, and I'm just going to paint the letters really quickly. And the same as what I talked about before, I like the variation in colors. So sometimes when I go back to reload my brush, I'll pick up a color that's just a little bit lighter and add some of that in. I very rarely just paint something just one flat color. But these paint up very quickly. With all of the wood cutouts that I paint, I never worry about getting paint on the side of the wood cutouts. It just on the final piece, it just doesn't show. But I am just kind of using the belly of the brush to sort of tap that paint onto the surface of the wood cutout. And remember, these wood cutouts have been cleaned by me before I started this piece. If you do order a wood cutouts, make sure you clean yours. Particularly if you're adding resin, we don't want any of that residue on the sides of these that come from the laser. We don't want any of that to end up on the final piece. So you saw there, I brought the brush back in with a little bit of a lighter blue and just added a little bit of variation to a couple of places. The only thing that I will say on painting the little letters like this is it can still take a couple of coats of paint. So you really just want to take another look at it and make sure everything got a good coating of paint. My stomach is growling. I always worry that the microphone picks that up. You can see here with painting the letters like this, how much nicer that is than, if you had tried to paint on the wording. I don't think that there's anything that I dislike painting as much as I dislike painting words on a piece. And you can see now what I was talking about before, how this blue is looking on that blue painter's tape. It's just really hard to judge the color of it. Coming back in on some of the areas again with just a little bit of a lighter color. If you do add resin to your pieces, all of these variations, the resin does something magical over paint. And I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, just barely. The little cardinal, that winter cardinal was our December class at Shelley Parker Art. And all of the different variations of color underneath of the resin just turned out really, really pretty. See if I can hold it up here on this little side camera for you to see it a little bit better. Really just such a fun piece. And I love, I do a lot of the really small pieces. I love doing the small pieces for me as a selling artist. They sell very, very well. I think people just like to decorate with the little pieces that they can just set on a counter or set up on a mantle. So I'm going to go forward a little bit. You can do as much or as little detail on those letters as you like. So in painting the hat, I'm using the Mars Black, but I'm also pulling in some of the gray. And like I mentioned before, I had a little bit of gray on my palette from another piece. So I'm using a little bit of that in this. You could certainly add a little bit of titanium white to the side of your black on your palette and have a little bit of the variation with the grays. So you saw there, I just dipped into a little bit more of the gray, and I'm just lightly when I'm trying to pull it together or a little bit, when I'm trying to soften the transition between the black and the gray, just use a lighter pressure to run across those colors and just pull them together a little bit. And I haven't talked about it at all in this video, but you'll see in all of the brush strokes that I make, whether it's the body of the snowman or the roundness of this hat, I'm always having my brush strokes go in that shape because all of those brush strokes add a lot to help the eye see the shape. So for this, if I had come in and done all of these strokes vertically, it wouldn't help to build the roundness of the shape. So it becomes kind of second nature. Once you've painted a lot, you kind of stop thinking about it. But even in the cardinal with the feathering, I'm always thinking about the brush strokes, following the contour and the shape of whatever I'm painting. Again, it's going to move on me. It would have been handy for this too to have the painter's tape down. So I'm going to come in and start building a little bit of the highlight. Many of these top hats are kind of silky, so I'm trying to give it that hint of a shine. So this is just gray that I've added in here. I'm letting it be a little bit strokey. You can see along the brim of the hat, I didn't make like one highlight that went all the way across. Allow it to break and change as it goes through. And then you could see me wiping off the brush there. I wanted to get the paint off the brush so that I would be able to come back in with a mostly clean brush and pull the brush lightly across those areas just to settle them in. So you see me after each stroke wiping the brush off. And at this stage, if you feel like I just got too much of that highlight in there, which I did. I felt like I had too much, but I didn't worry about that. I like to come back in and put the shadows back in again. So here I'm restating the shadow right underneath the band of the hat. So once I put the paint in, then I can, again, wipe the paint out of my brush. I can dip it in a little bit of airbrush medium just so I have a damp brush, and then go in and feather the edges a little bit, just settle it in a little. Back in on the edges, again, with a little bit more of the true pure black. For my piece, I'm going to be adding a little bit of glass, and I'll show it at the end of this video what I'm planning to do for mine. Um, but in all of my classes, I like to show how you can paint it, even if you're not adding glass or resin. So for all of my pieces, even when I know that I'm going to be adding these things on top, I enjoy the painting process. And so I get the music blaring and just really settle into the painting process. I think that there's something very therapeutic about sitting down with a palette of paint and creating a piece like this. So I hear artists talk about, I worry about how much time a piece takes. I'm a selling artist. I don't, I want to get a lot of pieces done, and of course that's where the wood cutouts do help. But I really paint for the joy of it, and so I try very hard not to let myself get stressed out about what the clock says. And I try to just unwind and really enjoy the process. So I'm mixing up a little bit of blue. Um, Again, going back to what we talked about before, this is the same blue that we've used in the snowman and in the background. So by adding some of that blue in, it helps to bring our piece all together. We want to use some of those same colors in other areas of our painting. So I'm just tapping some of it in. You saw me, again, take all of the paint out of the brush and then come back in and just lightly, just barely touching, drag some of that paint across to settle it in. It's not really blended. It's really just sort of settled into the other colors. So now the black on the sides is still a little bit wet. So you'll see me here just trying to diminish that highlight just a little bit. So by taking my brush into the black that's wet and pulling it into that highlight that I just did, I can shrink the highlight down just a little bit. And there I was looking at what I'm planning to put on the brim of my snowman's hat. On the tracer that you'll see when you download that, the original drawing has a little bit of greenery. You could certainly glue something like that onto his hat. Hobby Lobby often has the little greenery picks that are wonderful. Take a little wire cutter and trim off edges until you have the right size for what you want. Let's go ahead and add the last video in. These are the finishing touches. So at this point, everything is dry. I've let everything completely dry, and now I'm coming back to my favorite part of any piece. I like the details. I'm not a big fan of the very first stages of a painting, kind of the ugly duckling stage of a painting. So I really get into these details. I'm coming back in and reworking the eye. Like I mentioned before, it's tiny and maybe not necessary, but the eye of anything that we paint will always attract a lot of attention from the viewers. So I never mind spending more time on it. So I was restating a little bit of that blue, almost a low light, honestly, and then a tiny dot of white for the highlight of the eye. And as I mentioned before, it's almost always too big, the very first catch light that you put in the eye. So I just go back into the black and tap that highlight back into shape. And people will often say, like, oh, your eyes, the eye that you painted is so beautiful. The secret is that. The secret is going back in with the dark again in the center. So we talked earlier about how hard it is to get highlights in anything that is red. So here's a tip. I'm coming back in and adding in mostly white. It's not a pure white. Like I mentioned before, I don't wash my brush out very often when I'm painting. So it's kind of a gray white that I'm putting in here. And now what I have on my brush is mostly pure red. So for my palette, that's Naphthol Red Light. So I went in and I pushed some of those highlights in. And then I decided that what I wanted to do was let that lighter color dry completely. So what I'm able to do, once this light area dries, I can come back in with a red that is thinned down with the airbrush medium, and I can do a transparent glaze over the top of the white. So what that does is, since the red is so transparent, some of that highlight shines through without it being pink, without ending up with a pink cardinal. Hopefully that made sense. That glaze back over the top is a technique that I use a lot on anything, particularly red. You can do the glazes on in other ways, but red is the effect that you get from putting the red over the highlight is really pretty. So you look at it at this stage and you're like, oh, she just made a giant mistake. It was better before. But you need to let that highlight dry before you come back over it with the glaze. So there's some little short strokes of the pure red there. All of those kind of help give the appearance of some feathering maybe, but he is tiny, so he doesn't need too much. So I'm going back to those same blue grays that we used originally. Now I'm just coming in and further smoothing the area. I want to really pop the brightest whites that I want to be right around his face and along the right side of him. So it will take a couple of different runs at the white to really get the true white that I'm going for in some of those brightest areas. I added in a little bit of the shadow area there, not because I wanted it to be darker, but because I wanted to have some wet paint to be working back and forth through. So I sat in some color. I'm using a little bit of the extender that I've mentioned before that I like to use to just wet this area. It's just got a little bit of paint, but mostly the extender, and that will give me just a base to be moving some of the white that I'm restating on his face. It just gives me something to work into. You saw me take a stroke of the brush there and stop immediately. I could see with the very first stroke that I took on the piece that it was the wrong color. So every time that I take my paintbrush to my piece, after I've done the brush mixing on my palette, each time as soon as I touch the brush on the piece, I'm deciding, is that the color that I want? And if it's not, don't keep going. Go ahead and pause, stop, and go back to your palette, add a little bit more blue or whatever you think that it needs to be more the right color, and then come back to your piece and keep painting. But I think that's That's a critical moment when you've mixed something and you come to your piece, really using your artist eye to assess if that's the color that you really wanted or not. And to have the discipline to say, no, it's not the right color, and I'm going to stop and fix it. I'm not going to, keep going with this color that I know is not right. So like I mentioned, I really want the front of his face to really shine. And here you can see what I was talking about before. Because I've added a little bit of the shadow over here, I've got a little bit of wet paint there, and I'm able to smooth that transition better. At this point, now when I'm coming back in for some of the final details, at this point, I'll allow my paint to be a little bit thicker. Um, Even though, like I mentioned, I'm trying to look for the smooth transition between colors, I don't mind the paint strokes. I want it to look like a painting. So by using some of the thicker paint and allowing some of those brush strokes to show through, I think, again, it just adds so much interest. It makes people just want to come up and spend a lot of time looking at your piece. So that's why, for me, I like to use the golden heavy body paints. Um, I like having that freedom to use thinner paints by adding either airbrush medium or my extender liquid. I can have them thinner, or I can come back in at the end with these details and use thick paint. I just kind of get the best of both worlds. I had I had just brushed my dogs, and I had a little tiny hair that I kept fighting with over and over. And then there was also a little hair in this brush that was giving me trouble. So what I'm trying to go for here, I'm trying to get the face as close to the brightest color of white that I want before I put the eyes in. Um, it's not impossible to come back in and lighten some areas once the eyes are in, but it's just a little bit easier if we have it close. So I spend a little bit of time really trying to get those brightest whites in. So I'm showing there how I put a little bead of paint on the very tip of my brush. It goes back again to what I was saying a moment ago about the thicker paint here. So I run the brush through my pile of titanium white in this case, and then you can either pinch the brush out. So I'll back up. I run the brush through the titanium white in an effort to get myself a flat area of paint. Then wipe your brush out so you don't have your brush loaded with paint. And then go in and you, almost like a shovel, scoop through that thin line, that thin area of paint, just to get the paint right on the very edge of the bristles of your brush. And then I can pull that little bead of paint right along that edge of his belly there. and build up a little bit of thicker paint. And the thicker the paint is, the more of an impact that it will have. And I'm not building up a lot of dimension. It's not like I'm building up um, a big ridge of paint there. I'm just adding just a little bit of thickness. So you can see there, still following the shape of the snowman. I'm beginning to fight with this white. This white that I'm using, the titanium white, is also a Utrecht brand, and I'm finding that it's beginning to do the same thing that the black did, where it gets just kind of a weird um, jelly sort of consistency. So I think I'm going to end up doing the same thing I did with the black and going ahead and just going to the Utrecht titanium white. It's just not worth it to fight with something. And I'm a big saver. I don't like to throw things away, and I don't like to waste things. So it's very difficult for me to get to the point where I make that decision. But I also don't want to be spending all of my time fighting a paint that's not working well for me. There was another hair on the piece. It's the hazard of having big dogs. They're pretty much worth it, I think. If you haven't done a lot of painting with acrylics, one of the things that's important to know is that your acrylics will dry about a value darker than you see them when they're wet. So you could see that little area of paint that I did on his arm there looked quite a bit lighter. Um, as it dries, it will dry down darker. And I think that that might be scary to some people when they think about it. You know, I think that one of the big things is to go a little bit lighter than you might think that you need to, but you can always come back in over the top and lighten areas if it ends up that it was just too dark. I think I think I would rather err on it being slightly too dark than too light. Um, it's our pieces need that variation, the darkest darks and the lightest lights, and so um, it's pretty easy to come back in and do a little bit more of a highlight in an area if you need to. And I did do that on this piece this morning. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end here. I'm going to go forward a little bit. This is um, a lot of just rebuilding the shadows. So it's all of the same colors that we talked about before. Um, Here I'm coming back in to the scarf. You could really see there where my paintbrush is really pulling along the paint. So when you feel your paintbrush do that, that's a great time to dip into the airbrush medium, or if you're using water, dip into that, just to allow your paint to flow a little bit easier across the surface. So I'm really looking at this point in the last look at your painting when you're doing those last details. That's where my eye is really looking for, do I have the shadows in place? And do I have the lightest areas in place? And like I said, this is the fun part, because the difficult part is that first, getting the first layers of paint down. Now, when you've got that base of paint in, it's just a lot of fun to go back in and restate some of those details. It's easier too, because but you have that base there, so it's easier to add in a little bit of dark or a little bit of highlight. And you might find for this particular area, adding in the shadows of the scarf, if you're having trouble with this, um, again, I recommend letting it dry. And you'll see here where my brush is almost pulling the paint up. It's difficult sometimes when you're trying to film a tutorial, that you don't want to have to wait forever for something to dry. But for you, I hope that you'll be able just to take your time a little bit, walk away from it for 15 or 20 minutes, and then come back and work on those areas again. So I'm going to go forward a little bit. Same thing on the hat. And here you can see me doing what I talked about before, just trying to narrow down that highlight on his hat. I knew that it was a little bit too thick, and that's okay. By coming back in now with everything dry, I can pull in that shadow, that highlight. I'm sorry. I can pull in the highlight with a little bit of black, just diminish it a little bit. You could see that there were some finer strokes. That's one of the things I love about the filbert brushes. I'm able to put them sort of on their edge, on their chisel, and drag across some of those thinner kind of streaky marks. So I'm going to start on the eye. I'm showing the round brush. I ended up changing. I'm not really a fan of the round brushes. And I think that it's important for artists to try a lot of different brushes. You'll find what works best for your hand. Some of you may use the round brushes and love them. For me, I feel so much more comfortable with the filberts. So like I mentioned before, on the wood cutouts, I can still see that shape of the eye that's engraved in with the laser. If you are using the tracer instead, if you have traced this onto your substrate, there's nothing wrong with coming back in, setting the tracer back on your piece carefully, particularly depending upon how you're tracing. You don't want any residue from the tracing paper to get onto your finished piece. But there's nothing wrong with coming back in and tracing the eyes back in. Probably much easier to do that than it would be to try to paint around the eyes this whole time. And speaking of tracing, if you are using the tracer to trace this onto your substrate, it's good to have some sort of registration marks. So if you do have to set it back on your piece, you know that it's lined up correctly. So you can do that a number of different ways, either by on the tracer itself. Let me go ahead and pull it up here while we're talking. On the tracer itself, this outer circle is the edge of the 12 by 12. So if you cut all the way around, then when you set the tracer back on your piece, you would be able to line it up again. But if you're coming back in to trace in some details like the eyes or the mouth at this point, it might be better to print the tracer a second time. So you have a clean tracer. And what I mean by that is a lot of times when I trace things, I'll do a charcoal pencil on the back of my tracer. So I'll take a charcoal pencil and scribble all across the back and then set it down on my piece. And then with a red pen, draw in all the details. So if you were to set that tracer back on your piece that already has some of that leftover charcoal on it, you could, of course, mess up your piece. If you had a second tracer, then you would be able to just use the charcoal on the back of just the eyes and the mouth. Now you have more control. You can set that back on and trace on those details. If you trace back on when your piece is fully dry, then you're not going to mess up the layers that are underneath. You could always come back and fix little areas if you had a problem, but hopefully those tips help if you're using the tracer. I'm sorry about my camera fuzzing out there. So here I have a little bit of blue. I'm using a very tiny little filbert. I want our snowman to look like he's glancing over at the cardinal that's going to be on his hand. So I'm using just a little bit of phthalo blue, a little titanium white, mixing it in that same area where we had the snowman gray before. And I'm just setting this blue eye color along the left and coming down just a little bit to the bottom. You saw me remixing the colors there. Like I mentioned before, I really like to do that. All of the different colors that I end up with each time that I go back to my palette, mix a color, and take it back to my piece, all that variation is good. So I was going to go back in there with more black, and I decided that what I wanted to do was overstate this blue a little bit more. So just like on the eyes with the cardinal, a lot of times I have more control by having a little bit too much of these catch lights or a little bit too much of these low lights, and then pushing it back into place with the black. It's so effective. So I ended up wiping my brush out and coming back in with a little bit more blue, just so I have too much on purpose. And now I can come back in with the black and shape the eye. And the same thing is true with the eyes as with everything else. There's nothing wrong with restating them a number of times. So I'll go back to the blue and restate that, then come back to the dark and set in the pupils again. When I talked about the cardinal and how it's so tiny and maybe a waste of time to spend that much time on the eyes, for our snowman, for our focal point of this piece, spending the time on the eyes is time well spent. So take your time with them, make little adjustments until you get it exactly the way you want it to be. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people that get started with painting they give up too quickly. So one of the things I say in a lot of my classes is, if you don't like it, you're just not done yet. If you don't like it, then you just need to keep going. And one of the great things about the classes that I offer is that I'm available to help. So many of the students will send me pictures of their pieces in progress and just say, what do you think? What am I missing? What could be a little bit better? So it's really great to have that sounding board. It's really great to have that friend that you trust, that you can send a picture to, and you know that you're going to get some feedback on it. And I think feedback is important for any artist. I like to have somebody look at my pieces and say, do you see something that I don't? Because I've spent so much time with this piece, and there may be something that really stands out to someone else that I'm not seeing. So it's always good to have that group of friends, a group of artists where you can share your piece and get a little feedback. So you saw me partway through there add a little bit of light to the snowman's eye, the blue part, just adding a little bit of interest. I'm coming in here with some catch lights in his eyes. Again, I know these are too big, so now I'll come back in with the black and push them back into place and settle them in. One of the nice things about coming back in with the black here is that you end up having some areas that are a little bit grayer because the black on your brush is mixing with the light color that's already there. And that can really add a lot of dimension and depth to the eye. So there I came back in with pretty much a clean brush, just tapped on top of those the lower lights that I put in his eyes, just to settle them down a little bit. And now I'm coming back with a little bit of black and just putting another layer of paint on top of the corners of the eye. That first coat of paint that I did there was a little bit transparent. I wanted it to darken it a little bit. And now, since I felt like that line was a little bit off, I came back in with a larger brush with just some of the titanium white on it, just to fix that eye a little bit. So take your time on that, and particularly the eyes, and don't be afraid to let that dry and come back in and do a little bit more with it. The eyes are worth spending the time on. So I'm just setting everything back together. It's nice to have the hat in place and see how it all looks together. I think that is maybe one of the most important things with something like the wood cutouts, since you're often painting the pieces in, separately in different areas. It's important to put it all together because, like we talked about earlier, color is so affected by everything around it. So putting it together really shows me the areas that I want to do a little bit more with. coming back in with just a little bit more orange on the carrot. This, like I talked about before, and um, the oranges and reds, as we talked about, are very transparent. So when I come back in with this orange over the top, um, the shadows that I put in before are still there, but I can just make them a little bit more subtle by putting the transparent colors over the top. So now it's time for the mouth, and that might be the part that worries people the most. Always remember that whatever happens, you can make it, you can fix it. So I have one of my favorite liner brushes. It's actually a rigger brush, and I have taken the Mars Black and Airbrush Medium, and I've really thinned down the paint to kind of a milky consistency. If you take your paintbrush to your piece and it's not making the mark that you expect it to make, your paint is probably too thick. So incrementally, just a little bit at a time, thin down your paint. And then with a liner brush or a rigger brush like this, you really want to roll your brush around in the paint. So by rolling it, you're actually, and I hope you can see it, you're actually loading these long bristles with a lot of paint. Um, and that will allow you to get the longer strokes of paint like you can see me doing right at this point. When I say that it's loaded with a lot of paint, I don't mean that there's a lot of paint built up right on this tip. So after I roll my liner brush in my paint, I will often take it to my towel and wipe a little bit off that's right on the very edge. I don't want it, a big buildup there, because if that happens, of course, when I take that to my piece, I'm going to end up with this big blob of paint, and I don't want that. So go slowly. Start out taking little strokes of paint just to make sure you have a feel for what the paint is doing on your brush. And then as you move forward and get more confident with what your paint is doing, then you can get the line that you want. You certainly could use a black acrylic paint pen if you wanted to put it in like that. That would work. But if you do it with a brush and you just don't, you feel like you messed it up, just correct the shape with the white paint like we did with the eye. So this is the little spacer for the cardinal. This just goes under his body and allows him to stand up on top. Since he's a layer above, since he's up on the snowman's hand, he needs a little bit of a spacer back there. That comes with the wood cutout. If you do want the wood cutout, and if you order the wood cutout, you get that spacer. So now we're going to start to paint in some of the trees that we put down at the bottom right-hand corner. What I'm going for with my trees is I want them to look like they're very much in the distance. I want them to be very atmospheric. To make anything atmospheric, and what I mean by atmospheric is that it seems to recede back into the piece. It becomes, as anything gets further away from us, it takes on more of the colors of the atmosphere or more of the colors of the sky. So I'm mixing a green with phthalo blue and my cad yellow, but I'm adding back into it some of that gray that we used before in the snowman and in the sky. My gray was drying out a little bit, so I added a little bit of burnt sienna and phthalo blue to remix a little bit of that gray again. And you'll see on that little pile, and on my screen, it's pretty small. If you watch this on YouTube, you can watch it on your TV and have a great big picture. But a lot of times when I'm mixing colors, I have variations, different values of that color across my palette. So a little bit darker, a mid-tone, a lighter tone. And then you can see me dipping into the airbrush medium there. I'm really thinning it down. I want this to be really transparent. So thin it down more than you think you need to. And then I have to look around my camera here. Then I looked at my tracer to get an idea again of what I had in mind for these trees. What I'm looking for is a variation of trees. Many times, and particularly on a piece like this, when you're painting something along this rounded edge, it would be very easy to stair step down these trees. So like have one that's tall, and then the next one a little bit shorter, and then the next one a little bit shorter. So I'm concentrating on not letting myself do that. But I'm also really concentrating on thinning this paint down, like thinner than you think it needs to be. So I start out at the very top and use my little filbert kind of on the chisel edge. And I'm thinking about a couple of things here. One of the big things that people do when they're painting evergreen trees like this is they let them get too wide too quickly. So I'm thinking about keeping it narrow. But I'm also thinking about the little branches at the top. I want them to kind of V upward toward the middle of the tree. I want them to be more horizontal. And as they get down to the bottom, I'm going to let them droop down. But and maybe watch this part of the video a couple of times. And then when you want to do yours, try it a few times in a sketchbook because you'll get more of the feel for it. I like to do my trees so that I'm doing both sides. In other words, I don't like to go down one side and then down the other. So you'll see as I paint these trees that I'm turning the brush in my hands and I'm trying to be very loose with it, tapping in the shape of the brush. And I'm not like turning my wrist like this. I'm turning my brush in my fingers. After I got this green one in, I wasn't sure I liked that color, to be honest. I knew I wanted some trees that leaned a little bit more green. I wanted some that leaned a little bit more blue. Of course, the bluer they are, the more atmospheric they are, and therefore the more they press back. But I wasn't sure I loved this green. And I like it more now than I did, but I'm going to show you some fixes and some things that you can do to help. So this is just a first. It's very much like anything else that we paint. This is just I'm just giving myself a little bit of an outline. So what I had done there, my piece was bouncing. So I used my hand to hold the piece down, but I had paint on my fingers. So I got a little bit of paint on the substrate there. I make a mess when I paint. Do you guys make as much of a mess as I do? But again, don't freak out. It's fixable. I'm going to make another mistake here in a second that I'll show you. So I just went into my palette. I still had some of that color from the background. So I'm just covering up the little the little paint mark that I left on my substrate. So like I was saying, this is just your first look. If you just start to base in the trees, I don't want to finish them here. I just want a base shape that will help my eye see where I'm going from here. When you do yours, please let yourself be free. Please don't try to necessarily do yours exactly the way that I did mine, because if you do that, um, you're going to lock yourself into something, and it's not going to feel natural. And so you'll be able to see with mine how they kind of come together, and how I can start to see which tree I want to come in front and which tree I want to go in back. So this is this tree a little bit smaller, um, a little bit bluer, and very, very light. You can see that I've really thinned it down. That's the trick with doing this. You have to really, it's almost no pigment at all. It's almost all airbrush medium with just the slightest little bit of paint in it. And what I did find here is that it was difficult to judge on this round what is vertical. So I felt like when I looked at this tree, it almost tilted, a little bit to the side. So in the next tree, I'm going to show you a way that you can help that when you do yours. Just there where I took the paintbrush and I made a line with it. I didn't actually paint a line. I was just helping my eye see the line. And so the way that I'm fixing this particular one is by just bringing that left side out a little bit more to make it look like it pushes back in place a little bit better. And then I'm using some of that same blue over in this green tree too. And I liked that look. When you're making that kind of decision, tap your paintbrush in, see if you like it. If you don't like it, don't do any more of it. But in general, it's nice to incorporate those colors. It makes them look like they go together. If the green tree has a little bit of those blues, the blue tree has a little bit of those greens. I'm darkening the base of this one a little bit. When you do yours, my advice would be set them all in very, very translucently, very lightly, and then go back in and decide where you want to darken. If you do yours that way, then you'll be able to decide which tree is behind. And you can make trees come forward by having their branches go over or overlap that tree that's behind. So the filbert brush is perfect for this. I love using the filbert brush for little trees like this. I like having it, I'm pretty much using just the very top of the brush, almost straight up and down, and using the very top of the brush, and then turning it to have those branches go in different directions. But again, like I mentioned before, when you practice on a sketchbook, and I hope you do, really concentrate on keeping the tree narrow. You can always make it wider if you get it done and you decide you want it to be wider. It's very difficult to make it thinner. So keep it very thin, and then concentrate on the branches at the very tip top of the tree pointing up, the branches at the middle of the tree pointing more horizontal, and the branches at the bottom where they're heavier pointing down. And this is where it's a good idea to have the tracer out where you can see what I've lightly sketched for you, get an idea of sort of the direction that you're going. It takes a little while to mix because, again, I'm trying to be very careful with the amount of paint that I'm actually adding. So really adding in the airbrush medium, wiping out the brush, really controlling how much paint there is. And now to try to make this straighter tree, I'm actually going to do a vertical tap. I'm going to tap all the way down. That just gives my eye a little bit of a line to follow. I don't need there to be a definitive line, but it's just a little bit of a guide for me. And you can see how much this is still kind of one of the it sort of bluer than the green one, but I you can already see just at this point with a few little strokes of the brush, you can already see that that tree already looks like it's further back in the background. And now, in an effort to not have them stair step, this tree I'm going to purposefully have be shorter. You could see me there tapping off the paint in my brush. I wasn't certain at this stage which one of these trees was going to come forward. They kind of tell you. They kind of, yeah, as you're painting them, as you're adding things, they kind of let you know what they want to be. But um, I'm really controlling the amount of paint in my brush by continually tapping the paint out. And right there is where I decided that this tree wanted to be in front of that one just to the left. And so I began to bring some of the branches from this tree overlapping that tree just to the left of the one I'm working on. So now that I have the shapes, now I can really decide, do I want anything to be darker? Um, Anything that's darker is going to come closer to us. So I'm being careful that I'm choosing correctly which one comes forward. Doing these trees, you really have a lot of options, a lot of different things that you could do. You could certainly add snow to them. That would be pretty. You could also do a atmospheric glaze over them. Um, So to do that, you'd want to make sure that the trees are completely dry, and then mix a little bit of the sky color the very same way as we did the trees, very thinned out with the airbrush medium. And then just um, wash it over the trees, and it'll be transparent. So, it'll just mist them out, sort of. So this is the backer that comes with the wood cutouts, and I'm just using it to space out my letters. So I've moved the snowman out of the way a little bit because the backer is too big, but I'm using Star Bond thick. That's what I like to use with the wood cutouts on my pieces. And I'm being very careful to add just the tiniest amount of glue to the backs of these. And then I'm using that backer for the spacing of the letters. So that helps me to be sure that I get them lined up the way that I want them to be. But I need to be very careful because I don't want to glue the backer down to my piece. So you'll see me pretty often lifting up and just double checking that I'm okay. I actually had thrown this away. That's why you can see the black paint on the side. I'd completely forgotten that I would want to use it for this purpose. So please excuse the black paint all over the side of the backer. I had to rescue it from the trash can. Using this technique to glue those letters is really a great thing, particularly on a round piece like this where it can be very hard to see if you've got it lined up the way that you want it to be. I'm just using a wooden skewer, a wooden shish kebab skewer. I get big packages of them from Amazon. I like to use them for things like this. The Star Bond glue has a bad habit of the nozzle of it gets clogged, and then you can't use the nozzle anymore. So I pour a little bit out. You can see my little piece of scrap wood to the side. I pour a little bit out on that piece of wood, and then use the skewer to very carefully put the glue just where I want it. The reason that I use the scrap piece of wood is because this glue is very much like a super glue. And if you use something like a paper plate, it will eat through it and make a mess. Ask me how I know. So the wood is just is nice. It doesn't allow, it's not going to eat away at the wood. You just want to make sure that you set it aside so you don't get your hands or your sleeves into it after you use it. But I reuse it over and over again. So it'll dry like that. And the next time that I have a piece that I want to glue, I'll just pour a little bit of glue on it. So I'm just holding that in place for just a moment. The little letters like this glue pretty quickly, maybe 10 seconds or so. During that time, you just want to make sure that you haven't bumped it and gotten it offline a little bit, because once it does dry, it's there, it's done. Here's the little exclamation point. I'm just going to do the same thing. I decided to allow it to overlap the top of my piece just a little bit. I like doing that on some of my pieces. I think it's kind of an interesting look. I try to choose to be careful where the overlaps are. So for the bottom of my piece, I don't want it, that was Higgins, sorry. I don't want anything to overlap the bottom in case I want to put it in like a tabletop easel or something like that. I don't want anything down there affecting that. So now I'm going to go ahead and glue on the hat. If you are using the wood cutouts and you're planning on adding resin, it's nice to make sure that the glue gets all the way around to the outside edges because the resin will seep under a little bit, and where you don't have a good contact with the glue, you can get some air bubbles. It's I should restate. You can get air that seeps out from underneath a piece, so a bigger bubble of air. So I just try to use the skewer and pull the glue out to the edges. You don't have to be absolutely perfect, but I am just trying to think about sealing down those edges. For this piece, this hat will be above the base layer. It's a second layer. So it's not as important to get to the edge as the full snowman piece will be. You can see me there just using my fingers to pinch between those two layers. That's really the way to tell that I've got it lined up really well. Add a little bit of glue to the nose. Again, pinching that edge to make sure that those two layers are stacked perfectly. And then for the spacers, I like to glue the spacer onto the back of the top piece. So in this case, I like to glue that circle spacer onto the back of my cardinal. It just helps line it up a little bit better. So for a spacer like this, the thing that I'm thinking about is trying to get that spacer not close to the edges. So when somebody views this piece, if they did look from the side a little bit, the more in the center it is, the less likely that people will really be able to see it. So I think I'm going to use this button on mine. I did have the red button. These are just from Hobby Lobby. The important thing about a really sparkly piece like this, if you are adding resin, be sure that you add the resin first and then set this on top. You wouldn't want to resin over a piece like that because it will really flatten it and take away some of the sparkle. So I'm setting the red one there. I just decided that I liked the silver one a little bit better. These are buttons, so they have a little bit of a piece on the back where you would sew it on. You can use wire cutters to try to trim that off. So that is it. That is him done. Let me go ahead and add him back in. And let's talk a little bit about some of the other things that we can do. I think that I do have all of mine glued down, except of course the button. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the class, I did use some interference paint from Golden. This is what I used, the interference blue. I may come back into the hat and settle it down a little bit. It's a little bit, well, from that angle, it's a little bit brighter than I want it to be. But like I said, when you turn it to a different angle, it doesn't show quite as much. It's like a color shifting paint. It's really, really pretty under resin. I did use the interference on, there's a pearl interference. I used it on his belly for that piece. And in at some angles, it almost gave it a yellow look, which I wasn't a fan of. I don't want my snowman to look like he's got yellow snow. So I didn't put any interference on the snowman himself because of that. Again, like I said, because it's color shifting, it only shows if you're just at the perfectly wrong angle. But I'm not gonna do it on this piece. Like I said, if you missed at the beginning of the class, this piece, this Let It Snow piece, is a large piece. I hope you can see his lantern. His lantern actually does light up. So that is a full class that's available at Shelley Parker Art. But what I have out is some black crushed glass and some red. This red is actually red that I made by crushing up red cabochons. A lot of times when you're buying fire glass, you have to get like a big 10-pound thing of it or something crazy. So smashing up some little red cabochons was a great way to get some red glass. The problem with red glass like this is it's difficult to, you can get some pieces that are just a little bit too big. So what I'm going to do is just lay some glass on his hat. I'm going to try on the brim of his hat up here. I'm going to try to make sure it's not in the way. I was just looking back at that piece. On this piece, I ended up not putting any glass on the hat, and I think I'll do the same on this one. It just kind of takes away from the button here. But I do also have some of this black crushed glass, and it looks a little gray when it's just out on its own like this. But when you put it over the hat, it really looks good. And when I add resin, if you've never worked with resin before, it's really, really fun to work with. Resin does a magical thing with glass like this. It will really pull it all together. It will really settle it in. But I'm just going to lay, just very easy, just lay in some bits of glass. The glass is adds a great texture, adds a great sparkle. So that's how I'm going to do mine. I did this morning glue down the main part of the snowman. So you saw in the video where I glued the nose and the hat. I did go ahead and glue the cardinal on. I will say for a piece like the bigger snowman where you're putting the glue on the entire back, I did have to hold it down for quite a while. And I just wanted to make sure again that it made good contact and got glued down. So where I said the letters took just 10 or 15 seconds, I ended up holding the snowman down for quite a bit longer. Because I use the slow dry mediums, it can take a little bit longer for the painting to dry. So if you are adding resin, I would give this piece at least 2 days, maybe 3 days, to just be sure that all the layers of paint got completely dry before I add resin. If you've never worked with resin before, please check out my Shelley Parker Art YouTube page. I do have videos there, just some hints and some tips and tricks on adding resin. I like to use KS resin. It's the only resin I've ever used. I've always had really great luck with it. So for KS resin, you mix, it's 1-to-1 parts. You use 1 part of the resin to 1 part of the hardener. And in my video, I go through lots of little tips to make that process better for you. ksresin.com has the calculator. So I would go into ksresin.com, open up their calculator, type in that I've got a 12-inch by 12-inch, and then it will tell you what your overall amount of resin is that you need. So if it said you needed 5 ounces, I would mix 6 ounces because I like to mix only even numbers. So I would mix 3 ounces of the resin with 3 ounces of the hardener, and then I would add it to my piece. Again, like I mentioned, I would take the little button off because I don't want to resin over the top of it. But resin is beautiful and makes really amazing pieces. So before we go, let me go ahead and remove this piece. This is the Christmas stockings piece that we did. This was our November class. So again, wood cutouts. You can see the layers of the wood cutouts, the layers of the wood mantle at the top, and then all the pretties that we added in, and just the beautiful shine of the resin. A little bit of the texture from the stockings comes through, but I love how that looks. So I hope you enjoyed this class. I really had fun making it for you. Like I mentioned, the whole class for the Let It Snow piece is at our Patreon channel. Our classes are just $9.95 a month. When you sign up, you get access to the whole library of classes. You can see our library of classes by going to shelleyparkerart.com. Click on the Patreon library and you'll be able to see all of the classes that we currently have, but we do a new class each month. And I've got lots of new things coming in 2025 that I'm excited to bring to you. So try this. If you do, message me on Facebook or leave me a comment here or send me an email. I'd love to see what you make. As with all of my classes, you do have permission to sell this piece if you make it. So you have no worries there as far as selling the piece if you're a selling artist. So I hope that you'll make the piece. I hope that you'll come join us. We have a Facebook page that's free. So look for Shelley Parker Art on Facebook. That link is also in this video description. So come hang out with us. We'll have some other new videos coming too that are free. So watch for those. But if you watch this and you have any questions at all, please just message me. I'd be happy to help you.